Down the valley runs the Belton and the Belton takes you home. Down Geronimo, Geronimo. If the silken victim can't leave you, take a look around. The air is full of troops that will battle on the ground. Till we join the ships of danger, till the lake begins to come. Down Geronimo, Geronimo. It's the glory of the glory, but you're ready, here we go. Down Geronimo, Geronimo.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm grateful to the MacArthur Memorial for this opportunity, and I'm honored to share this time with everyone today to discuss the Los Baños raid. This has to be one of the World War II's most fascinating operations, and I kind of share in some of the sadness of the rescuers who are still alive and told me they wished more people knew what had happened 76 years ago. Now, I first heard about the Los Baños raid from my own grandfather, who, as a young lieutenant, served in the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment in World War II before he was wounded. Over the years, he and I had a lot of conversations about the war and the 511th's role in the Pacific Theater. And he passed away in 2016 at almost 99 years of age, and I miss him every day. My grandfather was my hero, but it led to an incredible opportunity to get to know many of the last living paratroopers from this regiment and some of the other members of the 11th Airborne Division. When I was asked to speak on this raid, the anniversary of it, I got really excited. Grandpa was fiercely proud of his regiment and the 11th Airborne Division itself. One day he told us about the time the division rescued over 2,100 men, women, and children from behind enemy lines. It was a story that really started my journey into researching the 11th Airborne Division and becoming a unit historian. It also led to me publishing a book on the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which I'll mention a little bit later on, but I hope today that what I share will help honor the rescuers and the rescued and inspire a greater interest in that fateful day 76 years ago. As Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh once said, the Los Baños raid, deep behind Japanese lines, ranks among the most daring and successful in our nation's history. Now, the story of Los Baños, it really begins in December of 1941, when Japan invaded Luzon and made their way into Manila. Among the American forces that remained in the city were actually 11 naval nurses who elected to stay behind and tend to the wounded. They were known as the Sacred 11. And they were known for their kind, encouraging spirits, but eventually they became prisoners of the Japanese. Now, the nurses were taken first to the Santo Tomas Internment Camp, but 14 months later, they volunteered to go help set up a clinic at a new camp on the shores of Laguna de Bay, which we know as Los Baños, as the Los Baños camp. In May of 1943, the Sacred 11 were transported to the Agricultural College of the University of the Philippines outside of Los Baños itself. There they helped Dr. Dana Nance set up a small clinic, which eventually would see an average of 200 patients a day. Now, by December, the camp's population was around 1,000. And at the time, they could still buy extra food and supplies from the people of Los Baños. So compared to some other camps on Luzon, things were not too bad, but that really changed in early 1944 with the arrival of Lieutenant Sadaki Konishi. If there's a villain in this story, his name would be Sadaki Konishi. Konishi was described as about 5'7", sadistic, ferocious, ignorant, and brutal. He had an intense hatred for the white race. While he was only second in command, The camp commandant really left the running of the camp to Konishi, which that had terrible repercussions for the internees. Konishi openly stated that he wished to starve his prisoners to death. And then he said, "By the time I'm through, you will be eating mud." Now, Konishi withheld the Red Cross food packages from the internees, and he also reduced their food allotments. And then he refused to allow them to go out and buy more supplies from the local population. Anyone who was caught doing so was shot, and several were. One day, after months of misery, Konishi told their hungry prisoners that he had sacks of rice that they could have if they would carry them over to their kitchen. So some of the weakened men in the camp volunteered to do so, and these sacks were 100 pounds, which to the internees felt like a ton. But they managed to do this, and they got to their kitchen with all the sacks of rice, and then Konishi said, "I changed my mind, you have to carry them back," which they did. And it was devastating for the internees, but it just kind of shows the daily malice that they were living under. Nurse Dorothy Still, who was one of the Sacred 11, she said, by March of 1944, the spirit at Los Baños changed. The camp just fell apart, and the food situation really deteriorated after that. Now, things only got worse when another 500 internees arrived in April, followed by another 500 in July, and then 150 more in December. So this brought the camp's population to about 2,000, which was putting a tremendous strain on the already reduced food availability and the sanitation conditions and their small hospital. With the camp so crowded, the internees had to build some bamboo and sawali barracks, which fit 100 people each. And you can see in this picture, they weren't very big for 100 people. This really left the internees with about 3 feet by 3 feet by 7 feet of living space. As one internee said, privacy just did not exist at Los Baños. So who were these internees? And in reality, they were just everyday men and women and children who happened to be living on Luzon when Japan invaded. Their only crime was that they were foreign. And the majority were Americans, but other nationalities included British, Australian, Canadian, Dutch, Norwegian, Polish, French, and Italian. They were school teachers, they were mechanics, engineers, secretaries, missionaries. There were nuns and priests and teenagers and children. They ranged in age from newborn to advanced in years, shall we say. But they learned that they had to work together to survive. They organized classes for the children. They had sports in the beginning when they had the energy to do so. They even had plays outside. But after July of 1944, 300 priests and nuns and other missionaries came into the camp, and they started having 130 masses a day in their makeshift chapel. And it was kind of funny because all the clergy were in the southwest corner of the camp, which they called Vatican City, which all the internees then said the rest of the camp was Hell's Half Acre. But by December of 1944, things were really starting to look bleak. Relentless hunger pains kept the internees awake at night. Konishi's guards were just becoming even more hostile, and diseases were taking lives every single day. So all but the most optimistic internees were starting to wonder if anyone would even still be alive when the Allies reached the front gates. And we have to remember the internees could hear the battle for Manila going on. It was about 40 miles to the northeast, but they had hidden radios that reported that the Allies had indeed landed on Luzon. And at night, they could watch the artillery flashes in the sky, and during the day, they could see the Allied planes flying overhead. So everyone believed that help would eventually come. They just didn't know if it would come in time. And as internee Terry Talbot wrote, she said, "We prayed in desperation that God would send his angels and all the hosts of heaven to rescue us." And this picture that you see here, it's kind of a famous picture. 16-year-old Margaret Squires, the young girl that you see standing kind of in the right, she noted in her secret journal, "The grave diggers are working overtime. The army must come soon." Now, this is a really interesting photo because it was actually taken by a Japanese photographer who wanted to use it for propaganda. Now, Margaret's mother is the woman you see there washing her hair. She knew exactly what the Japanese wanted, so she whispered to Margaret, "Don't smile and don't look at the camera." So rather than appease the enemy, both women defiantly looked down. So while their spirits were still strong, their bodies were starting to give out. Some reported losing up to 50 pounds of body weight as Lieutenant Konishi reduced their rations even further down to 150 grams of unhusked rice a day. No wonder the internees were secretly trading jewelry, watches, pens, whatever they had of value with the guards for extra food just to stay alive. They also augmented their diet with slugs, worms, cats, rats, dogs, and leaves. They even put up a sign, half joking but half serious, that said, "Keep off the weeds, we eat them." Now, things were so bad at the time that Reverend William McCarthy said, "At the time of our rescue, the camp doctor told me that most of the internees would have died of starvation within 1 month." The internees were also worried that the guards could simply just shoot them all and abandon the camp. So death was a constant reality for these men, women, and children in camp. And the Japanese initially built wooden picnic tables for their prisoners to eat on, but as time progressed, that wood had to be used to make coffins to bury their dead. So the fight for survival at Los Baños, it was coming to a high point in late 1944. One Catholic priest said, "If we're going to get out of this alive, we better pray." And a nearby nun said, "If we're going to get out of this alive, God will have to send the angels," which I find very ironic, because little did they know that the 11th Airborne Division, the angels, would soon be on their way. But let's leave the internees behind for a few minutes, and let's kind of switch gears and go and talk about the other main characters in the story of Los Baños, and that would be the angels, the 11th Airborne Angels. The 11th Airborne Division was formed at Camp McCall, North Carolina, on February 25th, 1943. That was just 3 months before the first internees arrived at the Los Baños Internment Camp. Now, the 11th Airborne was an elite, highly trained unit commanded by Major General Joseph Swing. He was one of America's most experienced and respected airborne commanders at the time, and his division was relatively small. It only had about 8,000 men in it, but the general set high standards. He expected everyone in his command to meet those standards. And thinking ahead of what operations he might be asked to perform with his men, he cross-trained his glider troops to be parachute qualified, and then he made his paratroopers become glider certified, which they hated, of course, but this actually made the 11th Airborne one of the most parachute qualified divisions in the U.S. Army at the time. Now, one of General Swing's main core combat units was my grandfather's 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which included some of the division's most capable soldiers. But once he got to know those soldiers, General Swing joked, "They were the greatest men in the world to go to war with, and the last people in the world I'd take home to date my baby sister." Now, the 511th formed in January of 1943 at historic Camp Toccoa, Georgia, under Colonel Orrin D. Hard Rock Haugen. Now, Colonel Haugen was one of America's first parachute officers, and before he was assigned command of the 511th, he served alongside some legends in airborne history, including William Miley, William Yarborough, Robert Sink, and William Ryder. Given his experience, Hard Rock understood what parachute troops could and would be asked to do in the war. So he wanted men who were intelligent, athletic, fearless, and bold. He set incredibly high standards, even higher than General Swing's, and they were so high that out of 12,000 men that volunteered for the 511th, Hard Rock only accepted 3,000. And then out of that 3,000, he narrowed it down to about 2,200, almost the same number of men as there were internees at Los Baños at the time of the rescue. Hard Rock pushed his men hard in training, which included daily runs up and down the famous Mount Currahee. And that actually led one of the paratroopers to say he spent his time at Camp Toccoa sweating blood. Passing all of Hard Rock's requirements gave the remaining paratroopers an understandably high level of confidence, which, well, let's just say in the future would cause some headaches amongst other division units. But one of the paratroopers explained, "We were felt to be mavericks and troublemakers and prone to feel superior to the rest of the division," which of course we were. Now, the men of the 511th understood that they had joined an elite unit that they could take extreme pride in. They were told that they could handle twice the amount of enemy as any other unit, and their non-coms repeatedly said, "You'll be able to chew razor blades and spit nails." And Hard Rock himself told his men, "When the bullets start flying, you will know that you are physically tough and mentally prepared for the shocks and real hardships of war." And the hardships of war were not that far off. After about a year and a half of intense training stateside, Colonel Haugen's 511th sailed from California over to New Guinea, where they really spent about 6 months from May to November of 1944 in theater training. This was the same period that things were really starting to take a turn for the worst at Los Baños. Now, the 11th Airborne was in the Pacific partially at the request of General MacArthur, who didn't have an airborne division in his theater at the time, and he wanted one. So MacArthur, whom the Angels, they called him 5 stars. And he would actually maintain a close relationship with General Swing's men all the way to Tokyo. But that's a discussion for another day. Now, in late November of 1944, while the Los Baños internees were fighting to survive, the 11th Airborne Division was fighting from one side of the island of Leyte to the other. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that campaign today because we're focusing on Los Baños, but I do want to convey just how brutal this campaign was for the Angels, especially for the 511th PIR. General Swing's men were fighting in Leyte's jungles and mountains during monsoon season, so they experienced kind of typical Pacific monsoon rains and muddy foxholes and really cold nights because they were high in the mountains. But they also had to deal with, of course, the Japanese, attacking like ghosts out of the darkness and dropping grenades in their foxholes and banzai charging their lines. And the Angels had to, go up against, reinforced positions that the enemy had built on the island. And on top of all that, my grandpa said, they didn't get a lot of resupply, so they spent 7 days without anything to eat. They ate, roots and berries, whatever they could find. It was a miserable campaign, and the officer said, our men never lost morale. But afterwards, after the war, of course, one of the Angels said, after Leyte, hell was a vacation. The 511th's campaign on Leyte only lasted 33 days, during which Hard Rock's men and the 11th Airborne Division as a whole eliminated about 6,000 of the enemy on that island. It came at a cost, though. Before coming down from the mountains on Christmas Day of 1944, the 511th's 2,200 men would suffer 409 casualties, which was 75% of the division's casualties on Leyte. General Swing may have questioned the character of the 511th before Leyte, but afterwards he knew that his men would stand and fight and get things done. And so did General MacArthur. He met with 2 of the paratroopers on Leyte, and he said, tell your boys that I'm real proud of the 11th Airborne. This photo was taken at one of the 511th cemeteries in the Leyte Mountains. And, the first time I saw it, it just kind of stopped me in my tracks to really see the cost of freedom that was being paid in the Pacific to free peoples that, these young soldiers didn't even know, but they wanted them to experience liberty. So while the Los Baños internees were burying their dead, their future rescuers were doing the same on Leyte. Jim Holsom of B Company, who would actually take part in the raid in a short time, he said this cemetery was just the saddest place on earth. Now, something happened in December of 1944 that really starts to bring our 2 sides to the story together, the 11th Airborne Division and the internees at Los Baños. There was a farmer from Leyte who went up to Manila, who sailed to Manila, and he was getting medicine for his wife, and he happened to pass by the Los Baños camp, and he looked and he saw these men and these women and children in just terrible conditions. And so he went back to Leyte, and he ended up in the 11th Airborne Division's headquarters. And he went and he stood before the G2, Henry Mueller, and he said, they're dying. Now, this was, for the Angels, the first time they'd heard about Los Baños, but Henry Mueller actually started gathering some what information he could, just in case the Angels would be asked to perform an operation to rescue those people. A few weeks later, on January 31st, 1945, the 11th Airborne Division landed on southern Luzon, and then they pushed north into Manila to take part in the bloody battle to liberate that city. I cover this campaign in greater detail in my book, When Angels Fall. But in 3 weeks, the Angels successfully broke through Japan's, defensive Genko line. They took Nichols Field, Fort McKinley, the Manila Polo Club, historic Intramuros, Mabato Point, and so on. General MacArthur said the fighting was of the fiercest sort. And while the understrength 11th Airborne achieved incredible victories during the battle for Manila, again, it came at a cost, especially within the 511th PIR. To give you an idea, on February 10th, 2 weeks before the Los Baños raid, my grandfather's D Company was finally given a break from the front lines. Captain Stephen Cavanaugh selected an assembly point to the rear where they could clean up, get a hot meal, and so forth. He'd been awake pretty much for that whole week, and his nerves were just frayed from that plus combat. And, he grew frustrated with what he thought was a delay in assembly for his company. And so he proceeded to chew out his first sergeant for what he thought was just, the men being slow. And First Sergeant Paul Farnsworth looked at Captain Kavanaugh, and he just had this hollow look in his eyes, and he said, "Sir, that's all there is." Everyone else was gone. In less than a week, D Company had sustained almost 40 casualties, 1/3 of the company's strength, and other companies were approaching 70% casualties, which is part of the reason when the 11th Airborne Division moved to perform the Los Baños raid, the 511th B Company was selected because they had the most men. Even Colonel Haugen himself would be wounded on Luzon, mortally, actually. He'd be wounded in the chest, and then he would die on February 22nd, one day before his boys performed their famous raid on Los Baños. Now, while the Angels were fighting in Manila, the famous liberation of the Santo Tomas internment camp took place. And on February 7th, General MacArthur visited the camp along with General Robert Eichelberger. Now, General MacArthur was genuinely concerned for all the POWs and internees on Luzon. He knew also that there were still 2,000 internees imprisoned at Los Baños, and he knew that fell under General Eichelberger's area of command. And so MacArthur told Eichelberger, get those people out of there as soon as possible. Well, who did Eichelberger give the mission to? General Joseph Swing and his 11th Airborne Division Angels. General Eichelberger wrote to his wife Emelina, "I am very keen about this 11th Airborne Division. They are small in number, but they are willing to fight. But there was a problem. General Swing accepted the mission wholeheartedly, but his division, his understrength division, was still heavily engaged in Manila. So he asked for and got permission to postpone the raid until his men were in a better place to effectively pull it off." That does not mean the Angels would ignore the internees at Los Baños entirely for the time, though. General Swing's G2, Henry Mueller, remember, he'd been collecting evidence and intelligence on the Los Baños camp since December, and now his efforts kicked into high gear. His main sources of information included Filipino guerrillas, which provided vital details on the camp's workings and the condition of the internees, and I cannot emphasize enough just how much local forces led to the success of the Los Baños raid. Aerial reconnaissance missions were also flown over the camp, which helped Colonel Mueller and his staff kind of start to sketch out a layout of the camp. But perhaps some of the most valuable assets for Mueller were a handful of internees who actually risked death to escape the camp and then contact local Filipino guerrillas. These heroic men improved the Angels' assessments of the camp and the internees' conditions. One internee in specific, Pete Miles, who's an engineer, and he had more or less a photographic memory. So he helped the Angels really fine-tune their layout map of the camp. And he could pinpoint where the machine gun emplacements were and the guard routes and so forth. But he also had one more crucial piece of information. Now, Pete told Colonel Mueller that the Japanese guards exercised every morning from 6:45 to 7:15. What's more, the guards actually locked their weapons up in the barracks while they were doing their exercises, so only a nominal force would be armed if the Angels decided to attack between 6:45 and 7:15, which is exactly what the Angels' planners decided to do. Now, one last source of intel was a group which played a critical role on the day of the Los Baños raid itself, and that was the 11th Airborne Division's Recon or Ghost Platoon. This was an all-volunteer group that was highly trained in scouting and observation behind enemy lines. They were tremendously effective in the Ley Campaign and in the Luzon campaign so far, and everyone in the division regarded them as capable fighters. Sergeant Martin Squires noted, "We were mostly college men, outdoorsmen, crazy as hell." Now, I want to point out an interesting component of the Los Baños history. Martin would take part in the raid, but then after the war, he actually married one of the internees that he rescued. Margaret Squires, the young girl that we talked about earlier, and theirs is just a beautiful love story. Now, 5 days prior to the raid, the recon platoon set up on Faculty Hill overlooking the camp, and they sent updates back to Colonel Mueller, as did some Filipino guerrilla groups that were also watching the camp. And one thing that concerned everyone was that the Japanese had local laborers dig a large pit in the camp's southwest corner, which you can see on this map here. Now, everybody knew that the Japanese guards could slaughter the internees at any time. So On February 21st, the 11th Airborne's headquarters received the following message. Urgent. Have received reliable information that Japs have Los Baños scheduled for massacre. The supposed date for the massacre? February 23rd, just 2 days later. There was no time to waste. The Angels would have to put their plan into action before everyone in Los Baños was killed. Now this map shows the 11th Airborne's overall plan, and I'd like to walk you through all the elements that had to harmonize for mission success. First, prior to the raid, the recon platoon would sail undetected across Laguna de Bay and meet up with supporting guerrilla units. And the recon men and the Filipinos would then spend all night hiking to their assigned positions outside the camp to strike enemy emplacements and guards at 0700 on February 23rd. Next, the 511th PIR's B Company was selected to jump onto a drop zone just outside the camp at 0700. They would then rush to help the recon platoon and the Filipino guerrillas eliminate the Japanese defenders. Now, B Company's commander was a young Lieutenant John Ringler, who had just taken over the company but was fully entrusted to get the job done. Now, I recently discovered the photo that you see here, and all evidence points to it being the only photo in existence of B Company prior to their jump on Los Baños. I'm thrilled to share that with you today, and I can only imagine the levels of excitement and anxiety that those boys felt the afternoon before the raid. Now, while the recon men, guerrilla forces, and B Company assaulted the camp, 54 Amtracs would ferry the bulk of the 511th's 1st Battalion across Laguna de Bay to take part in the rescue. Now, joining 1st Battalion would be Battery D of the 457th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, as well as some men from the 127th Airborne Engineers, and they would help delay any Japanese forces in the area that would be moving to attack the camp. Now, lastly, with between 8,000 and 10,000 soldiers of Japan's 8th Division in the vicinity, General Swing sent a diversionary blocking force under Colonel Robert Shorty Soule towards Los Baños. And this blocking force would cross the Calamba River, and then they would try to make as much noise as possible to keep the spotlight off the Los Baños raid. The task force would then fight its way to the camp, then egress with the 511th's 1st Battalion, while the internees shuttled across Laguna de Bay on the Amtracs. Now, I have simplified each mission component for the sake of time, but I want to emphasize the very real dangers that the rescuers and the internees faced in this operation. If the Japanese guards discovered the raid beforehand, they could quite easily just kill everyone. And if enemy forces in the area mobilized, well, they could then swoop in and, with their superior numbers, overwhelm the rescuers and the internees. In fact, due to all these potential hazards, B Company was told that mission success would be declared if only 1/3 of the internees made it out alive. But the battle-hardened Angels were not intimidated at all. Lieutenant Ringler noted, everyone had the attitude, it not only can be done, it will be done. And once word of the mission got out, paratroopers from across the regiment were begging for a seat on those C-47s. And I can say that there were a few non-B Company men who snuck on board. So what exactly happened on that fateful morning 76 years ago? Well, first, the 11th Airborne's recon platoon and their Filipino companions crawled to within meters of their assigned targets. 3 minutes to 7, a Japanese sentry shot at a small animal, which led the Filipino guerrillas and the recon men to think they'd been spotted. So 3 minutes before schedule, they opened fire on the sentries and began assaulting the machine gun emplacements and then made for the front gate. Then at 7 o'clock, Lieutenant Ringler led a reinforced B Company on their jump onto the DZ outside the camp. Dropping from just 400 feet, the paratroopers quickly rushed towards the camp, eliminating a machine gun nest on the way, and then moved in to help eradicate the final guards. Meanwhile, the surprised internees crouched in their barracks, some still eating their breakfast, as bullets flew overhead. Many prayed while others shouted, "They've come! They've come!" With the guards dead or escaped, the recon men in B Company rushed through the camp yelling for the internees to get ready to leave. Sister Louise Kroger said, "We thought each meant an angel, and a giant one at that. They were massive compared to our malnourished men in camp." Several priests fell to their knees in prayer, which caused one paratrooper to touch one of the priest's shoulders and said, "Come on, Father, let's get the hell out of here." Another trooper was surprised when he rushed into the barracks, and a woman asked if he was a Marine. He said, "Hell no, I'm a paratrooper." And then she replied with disappointment, "All my days at Los Baños, I have dreamed of being rescued by a Marine, and you're not a Marine." Of course, he helped her anyway. Another internee cried out, "It's been a long time we have waited for just such Hollywood American stuff." Well, stories like these abound, but it wasn't long after that somebody shouted, "Japanese tanks," which of course got every raider's attention, but luckily it was just the Amtracs which had finally arrived, carrying the bulk of 1st Battalion, which unloaded to help the internees get moving. But the former prisoners were a little busy. They were celebrating. Some were actually still cowering in their barracks. They were too scared to move. Some wanted to gather their meager belongings. There were some who actually wanted to have tea with their rescuers. Lieutenant Ringler and 1st Battalion's Major Henry Burgess discussed the dangers of lingering in camp. If the Japanese forces were on the way, the Angels and the internees had to move fast or risk serious losses. And then they noticed that some of the internees were moving away from a few of the burning buildings. So in the need for haste, the Angels decided to increase the number of fires, which that seemed to get people moving. After loading up 130 of the sick and feeble in Amtracs, plus some of the women and children, the Angels organized the healthier internees for their march down the Highway of Freedom towards Laguna de Bay. Now at the shoreline, the Amtrac slid into the water and headed northwest towards Mamatid, while the rescuers formed a defensive perimeter around the remaining internees on the beach. And then at Mamatid, the overjoyed internees were met by scores of ambulances and trucks, which eventually carried them to Bilibid Prison in Manila, where they were fed as much soup as they wanted and cared for. The Amtracs, however, they made their way back across Laguna de Bay to the beach outside Los Baños, where the last internees and the rescuers loaded up for the trip back to friendly lines. As they were leaving, however, the first of enemy forces arrived and began firing on them and dropping mortars. Major Burgess said that they were close enough that he could hear the Japanese officers giving verbal orders to their men. The rescuers and the internees left with only seconds to spare. How good freedom felt to the 2,100 internees who had suffered under the Japanese for so long. The smiles in these photos really help portray just how happy they were. Instead of a massacre, the Angels pulled off one of the most daring and incredible rescue operations of the war. When General MacArthur heard of the mission's success, he said, "Nothing could be more satisfying to a soldier's heart than this rescue. I am deeply grateful. God was certainly with us today." You know, my friend Bob Wheeler, he was just a boy when the Angels rescued his family that day. He said, "If they hadn't come, I'd be dead. The Japanese had our graves dug, and I wouldn't have had 2 kids, 9 grandkids, and 12 great-grandkids. Instead of being massacred, 2,142 men, women, and children were able to live their lives as free people, thanks to the rescuing Angels." As Bob said, they were a special breed of men, those men who came that day. Superbly trained, thank God. Men who went home after they served, going on with their lives, humble, proud that they served. Eventually, the Angels helped liberate Luzon and went on to become the first Allied unit to land in Japan, raising the first American flag there on August 30th, 1945. General MacArthur even chose the 11th Airborne to act as his honor guard at Atsuki before they safeguarded the departure docks used by dignitaries for the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. The Angels also helped guard General MacArthur's accommodations at the new Grand Hotel. But of all the many accomplishments of the 11th Airborne Division, perhaps the one the Angels are the proudest of is the day they rescued over 2,100 internees from behind enemy lines. If you would like to learn more about the history of the 11th Airborne, especially the 511th PIR, and their role in the Los Baños Raid, I would invite you to read our book, When Angels Fall, From Toccoa to Tokyo, the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment in World War II. I also want to invite you to visit our regimental website, www.511pir.com, and there you'll find wartime photos, interviews with the Angels, a digital museum, a research library, and so much more. Thank you for joining me today.